What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Samsung Galaxy A04s and the Samsung Galaxy A13. Now, keep in mind, this is not the A13 5G. That is a completely different phone. This is the 4G version of the Samsung Galaxy A13. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about either phone individually, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about each of them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Samsung Galaxy A04s, we're getting a 6.5-inch 90Hz PLS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 270, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. With the Samsung Galaxy A13, we're getting a 6.6-inch PLS LCD display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 400, and a 20:9 aspect ratio as well. So between the two, these phones actually have pretty similar displays, same display technology, almost the same size, and the same aspect ratio. So in general, if you're not going to be consuming a ton of content, the experience is going to be pretty similar. That being said though, with the Samsung Galaxy A13 with a 1080p resolution versus only 720p with the A04s, the image here is quite a bit sharper. So if you are consuming a lot of content and doing stuff where the image quality is a bit more important, like for example watching videos or maybe playing games, you will get a better experience with the A13. That being said though, but then again, the A04s really isn't bad, and if you're watching the occasional video every now and then, things are still going to be perfectly fine on this phone. So if you are more of a light user and you're not consuming a ton of content, then yeah, this phone is going to be perfectly fine. But if that's more really what you're going to be doing with your phone, you will be happier with the A13. Now for storage, both phones are getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion. But one thing I do really want to point out here is that if you're in the US, keep in mind the version of the Samsung Galaxy A13 offered by US carriers does only have 32GB, which is honestly really too bad. And as of right now, this could change by the time you're watching this, but currently the Samsung Galaxy A04s is not being offered by US carriers. So right now, the only version of this phone we have does have 64GB. Now, when and if this phone does eventually make it to US carriers, considering the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G only has 64GB, I imagine the US version of the A04s, if it does exist, is probably only going to have 32. But for the purpose of this video, since both phones in my hand are technically international versions, they both do have 64GB, which is a pretty reasonable amount of storage. But again, just keep in mind, if you are in the US considering a US version of the A13, you're probably only going to have 32. That being said, honestly, the unlocked international version of this phone is really not that expensive anyway. So if you do want this phone and you do want more storage, then you could probably get one pretty easily. Now that being said, with 64GB, again, I definitely think this is a pretty reasonable amount of storage. Sure, it's not crazy high, but keep in mind these are really low-end, affordable devices, and not a whole lot of phones in this price range are going to have this kind of storage. But overall, for the average user, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone and you make sure to offload things to a microSD card whenever you can, with 64GB, I do think you will be perfectly fine. Now again, if you get the US version of the A13 and you're getting only 32GB, then I feel like that's a completely different story because, in my opinion, unless you have like 5 apps on your phone, 32 is really just not going to be enough for anyone, especially in this day and age, with things like apps, the system, and just files in general getting larger and larger over time. Unless you are a really light user, using your phone for pretty much the bare minimum, you are probably going to want at least 64. For security features, both phones have Face Unlock, and they both have fingerprint scanners right here on the power keys. So definitely nice to get both options here. But starting with the A04s, let's give them a try. There we go. One more time. And there we go. And now for the A13. There we go. One more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive. No issues at all. And again, both phones do have Face Unlock too. So if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setups here, with the Samsung Galaxy A04s, we got a water drop notch for the front facing camera. This camera is 5 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. With the Samsung Galaxy A13, we got pretty much the exact same design for the front facing camera. This camera is 8 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a full quad camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, as far as camera setups go, especially considering these are really low-end, affordable devices, I do think both of them are actually really good. That being said though, of course, with the Samsung Galaxy A13, we do have an ultra wide camera, whereas unfortunately the Samsung Galaxy A04s doesn't, which I'm not really that surprised. This is pretty much Samsung's lowest end phone, so that is okay, I guess. But with the A13, I definitely am glad to see this phone does have an ultra wide camera, especially considering considering for whatever reason, the A13 5G doesn't have one. And for that matter, neither does the A14 5G. So at this point in 2023, with ultra-wide cameras being so much more common, I don't really know what's up with that, but at least this phone does have one. So if you are looking for a really affordable phone like this, and you do want to get those wider angle shots, then this is definitely going to be a great thing for you. Now, when it comes to photo quality, first of all, I do want to point out, for what they are, these phones are really good, which is probably not surprising considering Samsung's are honestly more or less known for their good camera quality. But in addition to this, I feel like between the two, there's not really a significant difference. Really, the only difference between these two phones when it comes to the camera is just that the Samsung Galaxy A13 does have an ultra-wide camera, whereas again, the A04s doesn't. And really, honestly, when it comes to everything else, I didn't really notice a significant difference. But again, no matter what you're doing, I feel like for the average user, the camera quality you get with either phone is honestly going to be perfectly fine for almost anything. If you're taking a lot of Instagram photos, for example, I really don't think you need a crazy good $1,000 phone for something like that. For that kind of thing, these phones are going to get the job done just fine. And in addition to this, compared to other phones in this price range, when it comes to camera quality, for the money, you're really not going to get that much better than these. To give you an idea of what they can do, first, here's some pictures taken with the Samsung Galaxy A04s. Again, for what it is, I definitely think it has great photo quality. I mean, with a 50 megapixel camera, I'm sure you can probably imagine, especially for an entry-level phone, the photo quality is just bound to be really good. So if you want to get some real nice pictures for like social media, maybe your own memories, maybe you're sending pictures to friends and family, or even something like Snapchat, no matter what you're doing, honestly, this camera in most cases will get the job done just fine. And even compared to phones that are a lot more expensive than this, even then, the Samsung Galaxy A04s really does hold its own. And then here's some pictures taken with the Samsung Galaxy A13, and again, I feel like there's not really a significant quality difference between the two, which is probably not surprising considering they both have 50 megapixel cameras. I wouldn't even be surprised if Samsung is just reusing the same hardware. But that being said, again, the quality is really good, and sure, if you're taking pictures all the time and that's really your thing and you want to get super high-end studio quality photos from your phone, then obviously at that point you might want to spend a little bit more money and get something like a Google Pixel or a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE. But for the average user, for stuff most people are using their cameras for, I do think either phone will be perfectly fine. So again, at the end of the day, it really comes down to whether or not you want an ultra-wide camera. If you do, then definitely go with the A13, but if you don't really care, the A04s is still going to be perfectly fine. Now, when it comes to RAM and processor, these phones are actually pretty much the same, both getting 4GB of RAM with the Exynos 850 processor. Now, it's kind of interesting here because despite technically having the same RAM and processor, I have noticed the Samsung Galaxy A04s is actually a little bit faster. In fact, for that matter, I feel like in recent times at least, the Samsung Galaxy A13 is pretty much the slowest Samsung phone being made. So yeah, kind of funny there, but if you want better performance between the two, I would go with the A04s, but keep in mind, the difference isn't really going to be insane or anything because after all, they do have the same processors, so it can only be so much. But in my experience, the Samsung Galaxy A13 is noticeably slow, whereas with the A04s, it's not really fast per se. But if you're doing more basic activities like web browsing, light social media, and maybe watching some videos every now and then, things do run a bit smoother. Now, I did run benchmark tests on both phones using Geekbench 5, and here are the results I got. So again, as you can see here, the A04s does have a bit of an advantage, but honestly, neither phone is really that fast. And at the end of the day, despite this slight performance difference, both phones are pretty much going to be doing the same kind of things anyway. And in my experience, even with the A13, I haven't really had any performance issues. It's just not really that fast. So at the end of the day, if you are looking for a more affordable phone for more basic activities, either phone will get the job done just fine. When it comes to the battery, both phones have 5000 mAh batteries that also support 15-watt fast charging. So pretty standard for a lower end Samsung Galaxy A series phone. I'm pretty sure the A14 5G actually has the same battery for that matter, along with the A03s and the A13 5G, so you get the picture. At this point in 2023, pretty much every new Samsung Galaxy A series phone is going to have a 5000 mAh battery and I guess halfway decent fast charging. 15 watts isn't really that crazy, but in my experience, unless you're expecting seriously lightning fast charging speeds, which I will say you're not going to find in this price range anyway, in general, the charging speeds with these phones is going to be perfectly fine. And of course, with 5000 mAh batteries, you can expect to get some great battery life and longevity here. So if that is a priority for you, then either phone will be a great choice. As far as the software goes, both phones do have Android 13, and in addition to this, knowing Samsung software support, you can also expect to get several other major updates in the future. Now with the A04s, seeing as this phone did come with Android 13, whereas the A13 upgraded to it from Android 12. If you really want the longest term software support, keep in mind the A04s will have one more update. But in general, compared to pretty much any other phone that's not a Samsung, both phones of course do have really good software support. Now unfortunately, neither phone has NFC, which honestly, considering the price range, is not too surprising, but I have heard of some versions of the A13 out there that do have NFC. I know the 5G model does, and the A14 5G does too. But as for the 4G version of the A13, I don't think it does. I mean, the phone in my hand doesn't. And I know for pretty much a fact that if you get this phone from a US carrier, that one is definitely not going to. So in general, if you do like to use tap and pay, you are going to want to get a completely different phone. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, in almost every way, I want to say, these phones are almost completely interchangeable. That being said though, there are a couple things to think about. First of all, with the Samsung Galaxy A04s, again, this phone is slightly faster. I feel like the difference isn't really that much, but it still is, I guess, sort of noticeable. And again, being about a year newer, it will get one more update than the A13 too. On the other hand though, with a 1080p resolution, the image quality with the A13 is going to be significantly better. So if you're watching a lot of videos, for example, or really just consuming a lot of content, especially where the image quality is a lot more important, then the A13 will have a huge advantage there. And again, with the camera, the A13 does also have an ultra-wide camera, whereas unfortunately the A04s doesn't. So overall, if you do want slightly better performance and one extra update in the future if you want to keep your phone for that long, then in that case, you might want to go with the A04s. But if you want a better looking display and an ultra-wide camera, then the A13 will be a better choice. And again, between the two, the A04s is not currently launched in the US. Now, by the time you're watching this could be different, but as of right now, if you do want to get a phone through a US carrier, the A13 will have an advantage there. But keep in mind, the storage and I believe the RAM too is going to be a bit less. But this concludes my comparison between the Samsung Galaxy A04s and the Samsung Galaxy A13. Again, if you want to learn more about either phone individually, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about each of them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.